All right. Hello, everybody. I'm Joanna from Joanna Reads, and today we are going to be discussing The Grace of Kings, which is book 1 in the Dandelion Dynasty. I have this wonderful broken binding edition here. Oh, Chris, you have the same
You
one?
might do. I'm just going to put mine down.
Oh, no. I like that cover too. But I have to say the broken binding really came through with these editions because the font, and not only are like the maps beautiful, and obviously the covers are just gorgeous, and the sprayed edges are just amazing for the series, but the font is so nice. It was really nice and easy to read with this font. I loved it. So we're going to go ahead and talk about this now. This has been a highly anticipated series for us to get to.
Oh, you have both. Oh, wow.
Yeah.
Okay.
I did have this prior to when the Broken Binding put out their edition. I was like, I'll have to get the Broken Binding edition. It's so gorgeous.
Yeah, I don't usually go out of my way to purchase special editions, especially if I haven't read the book yet and I'm not sure. But in this case, I took a risk because I know it's such a loved series. I had so much confidence that I would love the series. I guess we'll find out. And if not, I guess I could sell my editions if I don't end up liking it. But I am happy to say that I did really enjoy book 1. I did enjoy Grace of Kings, which is all I've read so far. And I'd love to hear from you two. Philip, why don't you go ahead and start? What were your first impressions? Be honest. I had the feeling that maybe this didn't blow you away.
Yeah. I mean, I don't want anyone to get the impression that I didn't like it, because I did like it a lot. It just wasn't a, wow, this is going to be one of my favorite series of all time. It wasn't that, okay. When I try to temper my expectations when I'm reading a book, but a lot of people love this series. But I've also heard that a lot of them have said that this first book is a setup book in many ways. And for me, it really did read like a setup book, but also like a history, kind of like I felt like I was reading Fire and Blood instead of a Game of Thrones. That's what I said on my channel. It's like, this felt like a little dry, a little, historical, even like a folk tale, actually, in many places. And, with the introduction of fairly consequential characters, halfway through, 3/4 of the way through, just kind of coming into the lives of the two main characters. The two main characters being Mata and Kuni, and we'll talk about them. But I felt like everybody else was sort of peripheral in many ways to them, or at least was in one of their two orbits. But yeah, it was a little disjointed, as if like that folktale thing. It felt like there was just like one historical episode to another, and there was and many times, because sometimes we were introducing a brand new character halfway through who had their own story to tell beforehand. It was like going backwards a little bit, and then now here's their part in the story, that kind of thing. So it was a little dry, but done very well, executed for what it is. It was executed very well, I think. Just when you're doing a history or a folk tale, it's not that conducive to having really deeply fleshed out characters. Okay, the norm for history and for a folktale is that the characters are very flat, and they're archetypal in many cases, as many of these characters are. Now, that's not a criticism. That is simply something that I think Ken Liu is a very good writer and uses these archetypes effectively. So it's not a complaint on my part. It's just an observation that, okay, this seems to be a setup, more history, reads like a folktale. The prose, I don't know why I expected the prose to be like, wow, I wanted to read another author, who was going to blow me away with this beautiful. It's pretty simple prose. And I'm sure that Ken Liu is very aware, uses that very deliberately, wants it to feel like a folktale. And folktales don't use incredibly intricate, complex prose. So I had to adjust my expectations a little. But I would say that I enjoyed this read, and I'm excited actually to read on in the series, because I do hear that the second book gets really great from a lot of people. So I'm actually excited to be reading this with you guys.
I'm so glad to hear it. Wonderful. Chris, why don't you go ahead and share your thoughts?
I same overall thoughts that Philip shared. I overall enjoyed the story. I do see the setup aspect of book one, but I also can see it as a standalone a little bit as well. I think it did have a nice, ending, bittersweet, tragic, story overall. The beginning was just something to get used to, and I think that's kind of what kind of took me a little bit of time, especially that first third of the book, because I wasn't quite sure who to follow or who the characters that we're going to be focusing on, until I realized that wasn't the intention. The intention is to give that perceptive, have everybody, we're in everybody's head. We get a point of view of every named character almost, and it's like that chapter, and then we get that pinpoint one part for every character, and then we move on to the next chapter, and it's somebody else, and then you don't see these characters again until like later on in the book. After I got used to it, I started just taking it as it is, and I love history, and I love the aspect of that it was presented almost like a history in a way. I feel like it was like those dramatization documentaries that you get where they act out like historical things, and then there's the narrator that tells you, the historical facts, but then they have the little dramatization of actors playing those roles. So I felt like that's kind of how this book was presented. And it's funny, I'm a very character-driven, focused reader, I was trying to get connected to the characters, and I was, I think there were characters that I was getting connected to pretty quickly, and there were characters that I'm like, are we going to get back to them? And, he doesn't disappoint, I want to keep this general for now, but like Gia, for instance, we had like that one character chapter with her in focus, and then we don't really see much of her until the last 1/3 of the book, and that was a nice reward. I think it's a book you have to be very patient with, I think, because I do think it's a very slow crawl to get to that second half of the book. And I think once you get used to his writing style, it reads a lot more smoother, and I was able to enjoy it. And I think from what I understand, this is sort of a dedication to a historical event. I think the Han Dynasty, if I'm not mistaken. And then I think when we get into the later books, he starts making it a little more of his own world and his own fiction. And that's why I think we hear so much about how much better the later books are. So yeah, I'll be curious to see where this goes, because I have no idea. I don't really have a theory as to what's going to happen next after this first book. But I enjoyed it, and I thought it was a pretty good book on its own right, but I hope to get more for sure.
I actually have a theory, but it would be spoilery to talk about it.
We could talk about that a little bit later, though. I'm going to start out, though, talking about my impressions as well. So with this book, I think my expectations were in the right place. I did expect that this would not be the most gripping book. I've heard a lot of people say that they were not hooked into the series until book 2. So I think my expectations were in the right place as far as that was concerned. Like, I didn't feel like it was overhyped for me personally because of that. But also, I think I was served by having read Ken Liu's Paper Menagerie before reading this, because I was used to his writing style. And I feel as though his ability as a short story writer, which I think he's an excellent short story writer, by the way, I think it comes through in the way that he presents this book with these.
It's a lot of short stories. Yeah,
it is. It is kind of like the lacing together, the stitching together of all these little mini arcs of a story. I was talking about that with Murphy, and talking about how similar you could see the parallels when you read those two books side by side, and that how he's like creating a dynasty by doing this. He's not just trying to give you the standard fantasy heroic journey that we're used to, where we're only following the hero and maybe only following the villain. I feel one of the things that was special to me about this book was showing various aspects of what it takes to create an empire and what it takes to create a rebellion. And so we're not just getting one perspective, a leader's perspective, not just a warrior's perspective, but also a strategist perspective. We're getting engineer perspectives. We're getting bureaucracy in the story. We're getting administration. We're getting so many different perspectives that make the whole, because it's not just one part, right? And so that's something that I actually appreciated about the book. I'm like, wow, I don't feel like I get that many different aspects of war and strategy and governance in my fantasy as I have in this book. I do agree that the style of writing is very accessible. It's something that I also noted in the Paper Menagerie as well. I would say that short story collection is something I could almost universally recommend because the prose is accessible, but it's in my opinion, in no way a sacrifice to the storytelling. And I feel like this book, while I agree that some of the characters don't stay with me as much. I can say that now, having had some distance from this book. It's been a couple months since I finished it. The characters haven't stayed with me as much as maybe some other fantasy books. So I do agree with that assessment that maybe the character depth is not quite as strong in this installment. At the same time, I feel like Lou did a great job of outlining in clear detail every character's motivation in this story. Like you never had any ambiguity about that. It was extremely clear. And I think I did feel like there was enough realistic conflict with some of the characters too. Like I felt like, oh, I could understand why this character was struggling. Because in this book, I feel like we not only get a lot of perspective on rebellion, on administration, like I mentioned, everything like that, or vying for power, but we also get jealousy. I feel like jealousy comes up quite a bit in this story. And I feel like in Brotherhood, conflicts of, I think one of the quotes in the book that stuck with me the most, I'm trying to think if I could find it. I have it written down here somewhere. I think I found it. How friendships among men tend to not survive great rises or falls of fortune. And I feel like that comes out quite a bit in this book. Like when people are close friends, how is your bond or friendship or even brotherhood? Is it going to stand the test of one of you rising in fortune or maybe going the other way? Maybe you have a huge decline in fortune. Is your friendship or connection going to stand that? Is it going to withhold? So I feel like the book succeeded in capturing, I think, what Ken Liu was going for. Now, I do have one side note about this. And speaking to Chris's point about how this was based on the Han Dynasty. Now, my knowledge of Chinese history is extremely limited, but I do take into account that maybe because it was influenced by Chinese history, this is an Asian fantasy, or Asian fantasy inspired, I should say. Obviously, he's doing his own thing as you go on in the series. I feel like for me, that did add some sense of novelty for my experience. And I do want to be transparent about that. At the same time, I do have a friend who is Chinese, who grew up in China. And she told me that she got halfway through this book, maybe not quite halfway, but she read a good deal into this book and quit because she said that it for her, it was not to her taste that she knew who every character represented in Chinese history. She said these are the stories that she was told repeatedly when she was a child growing up and going to school. So in other words, the novelty aspect of the story was totally like not there for her at all. If that's something that is appealing to some people, but if you're like me and this is not something you're totally familiar with, it might be of interest to you. And again, as Chris said, I understand that Ken Liu does depart from that as you go on in the story. And the other thing that I enjoyed about this book, airships. The airships were just cool, in my opinion. So I liked that. So from here, we'll go ahead and go into spoilers. Spoiler thoughts. So it's interesting that we start with this empire that's established, and then we kind of get some history as we go on in the story, that this isn't the way that this has always been, that there were originally what were called Tiro states. It was divided in a different way, and now we're under an emperor. And there are a lot of people who are not happy about this. Clearly, the person who attacks him from the sky. Yeah.
Whom we later we later find out that that is Luan, who becomes a very important advisor and also inventor. On primarily he kind of comes and goes, but primarily he helps Kunigaru in his endeavors. But yeah, no, I thought that it was a good introduction that introduces a major theme in here, which is governance, and what is the best way to govern a people, and the ambition of this emperor Mapadere. Please don't mind my pronunciation; it's going to be way off.
Better than mine.
Yeah, I apologize in advance because I, like Joanna, I'm not well versed in Chinese history or how to pronounce a lot of these names. But
and he did change the names, by the way. Like he changed the names, but it was, to my friend, obvious who he was referring to with each of the character names. Yeah.
Yeah. I lack enough knowledge to know any of that. So for me, it was fairly novel, and I liked that, I guess, too, like you. But anyway, yeah, I thought that this is a good introduction to this man who is not a straightforward tyrant, because he had some actually really important ideas and things that did improve people's lives. There was a more interaction between these various states that used to be at each other's throats. There's enrichment of people's lives on some level. But another theme that you see here is that power seems to corrupt, and there is a degree to which those initial laudable goals have been buried beneath his megalomania and his, putting people on these horrible, there's a lack of humanity. That's the problem here. When you get these grand visions of you want to achieve something great, it's kind of like the ends justify the means, or you lose sight of the individual's humanity in the pursuit of this grand goal to make the society better. Well, are you making the society better when you're stomping all over ordinary people to get to your goal, right? So I think that is introduced early here as well, and those are great themes that are woven throughout this story. It's not just Mapadere. There are all kinds of characters that these two themes seem to be applicable to. The idea that they have a vision, and there's a lot that's good about this vision, but when they get into positions of power, their actions often have negative consequences for not only their own followers, but often enough for the general populace. So I like that a lot. And you get introduced to this sort of mischievous fella, Kuni, who's he's a really lovable character, right? He's complex and flawed, but kind of fun, and you get a sense of who he is even at this young age. That he has there's something about, even though he seems not terribly ambitious, but he has a kindness about him, and there seems to be something to him that could give one a sense of greatness. Like he shields his friend from getting burned, right? He lies over his friend in order to prevent him. That's Rin Koda, right? When they're young, to prevent him from getting burned. That tells you a lot about him as a character, I think.
Yeah, I love that. I think this would be a good time to just go ahead and talk about Kuni, and really well said, by the way, Philip, about some of the themes that we're presented with in this story, and also what you said about how maybe things weren't so bad with this new emperor. Maybe there was some good with this, because I think that is something that comes up, especially as we're dealing with rebellion. Something that I always appreciate in a rebellion story is when the people who are leading the rebellion think through what they want to put in its place instead of just the point is the rebellion.
How many times have we seen that in history? How many revolutions end up with something worse than what they got rid of? Yeah.
Right. Yeah. Excellent. Yeah. And I agree with what you said about Kuni, that he's this lovable character, especially towards the beginning. We get a sense of that. He has a natural charisma. He's a bit of a trickster. Yeah. He has a way with people. And yeah, so any thoughts you want to add to that, Chris? And you could add other characters too if you want to with that.
Yeah. For sure. I love the intro. We also got the intro to the world being a little bit technical. I think Ken actually calls it
Silk punk.
or something. Yeah.
Yeah.
So we get the mechanics of, you know, the kite flying and all that. So we start learning, and then the airships come in. So we start getting a little bit of that world, and I think that's really kind of was the hook for me. And it almost read like a regular fantasy story in the beginning there for me as well too. So it really got me connected. I'm always a big fan of the trickster archetype of characters. So he was instantly likable for me, especially like Philip mentioned, where he protected Rin. It was like his first instinct, knowing that Rin probably can't protect himself or is not as capable of doing that. So he was he's very reactive to that. You know, and he had that charisma of just being that friend that just kind of gets you in trouble, but he's just fun to be around, and yeah, instant likability for me. And I'm glad he was a main character, because when you're reading it and we start changing characters, it's like, oh man, I need Cooney back in some chapters. But I appreciate that we just get that interactive. When we were talking about how power corrupts, you noticed that throughout this whole book, just this cycle of characters that, you know, have good intention. Like when we get to the first rebellion with Huno and Usopp, you know, if initially you kind of like them, you know, we're against the evil empire here, and so you're always pushing for that rebellion, and then you find out that, you know, eventually corruption affects even people with good intentions too. And like you mentioned, Joanna, even like some of the ideas that the empire had, the intentions are there, but how are you implementing, you know, how are you implementing your laws and all that, and how they affect the common people too, and all the lives that they affect.
Right.
Good
Yeah.
start for sure.
So yeah, that's something that's part of Cooney's character, is he was a visionary. So he was a visionary. He had a new vision for the empire, or for what would be the new empire, I guess. But which ends up obviously splitting from, or dividing from, what Mata has in mind, as we get these two perspectives. I guess we can go into Mata and Gia as related perspectives to Cooney. But yes, just to follow up on your point about Cooney, in a way, a very tragic character, because we see how many great qualities he has, and how many great qualities he has throughout his leadership, throughout this book. Just full spoilers here, because not only is he charismatic, not only does he have a way with people, and he considers other classes too. He doesn't feel like he's above any class in society, which is a huge perk for him, as he uses that to his advantage in the story. But he's also good at delegating tasks. He's good at listening to other people.
Mhm.
And so you see how he understands his strengths and his limitations. And he realizes when other people around him might have strengths that he might not have. And at the same time, he also has enough foresight not to follow through with all of his impulses in every moment, which is an incredible, I think that's an incredible aspect to him, considering all the other parts of him. But unfortunately, I think that what we see with the emperor in the beginning of the story, is the emperor Mapidera doesn't have many people around him he can trust, is what we learn when we get to know some of the characters around him. We start to learn how that affects Cooney as he rises in power. But before we get more, and we can go into that if you all want to, but I also want to make sure that we touch upon Gia and Mata as well. So yeah, Philip, feel free to respond.
Oh yeah, just a final point for me about Mapidere, which is that it's his undoing is really on him in many ways. Like his trusted advisor was someone that he treated poorly, you know, and his whole this guy's idea of destabilizing the empire is his vengeance, right? He brings about tries his best to sabotage the empire, because of what was done to him. Mappadere does horrible things to other people. By the time we meet him, he's become. I like how Ken Liu literalizes his corruption by making him in these futile attempts to prolong his life. He's made himself sick, essentially, and you can see where his ego became the focus rather than his great goals to make society better. It became more and more about him, and he's become more isolated because of what he's done to other people, and he's out of touch. You see that often with leaders who lack the exact skills that you were talking about, Joanna. These are what make Cooney an effective leader, because he does listen to people. He is humble enough to take their advice into consideration, to have second thoughts, and that sort of thing. His ego is not at the forefront. And that's what distinguishes him, I think, from even Mata, for example. Mata is going to be this great, glorious warrior king who's going to win great battles and show his prowess to everybody. And I kind of found that tiresome, actually, whereas I enjoyed Cooney's humility. I enjoyed his he's kind of salt of the earth kind of guy who's interestingly, though not regarded by society as noble, it's some of those ordinary qualities that actually make him a more effective leader, and why he, in the end, prevails. So yeah, but that's it for that. And then I don't know if anyone else has anything there, but I'm ready to talk about the other two, Gia and Mata, if you are.
Just my final thoughts on like the initializing of Cooney, and actually throughout the whole book is I had next to him is compassion and forgiveness, and that is something you don't see with many of our, especially our leader characters in this book. Most of them are very arrogant and like my way or the highway kind of motto feeling, whereas Cooney, as you guys mentioned both, he does listen, and he listens to everybody. He listens to Gia, he listens to his friends, everybody who has input, and that was a unique part of Cooney to me that I enjoyed, was his compassion and the forgiveness. And he would be questioned about especially the forgiveness aspect of it, because it's like you're giving these people the opportunity to essentially walk over you again, knowing that you may forgive them or not in the future. So I like those aspects, and it was such, it just made Cooney stand out to me more than most people in this book, for sure.
Well said. Yeah. Fantastic. So let's go ahead and go on to Gia now. Okay. So Gia was, to me, a very interesting in-depth character as well. She is somebody who had some complex conflicts within her, especially as even when she falls in love with Cooney. Obviously, this goes somewhat against what she was set out in society, the person she was set out in society to marry. It was against the standards for her. I guess she had to really fight for it, if I remember correctly. But not only that, she knew from a dream, I think she had some kind of premonition that she was not necessarily, while she would be happy in some ways with her love of choice, it would also bring her tears. It would also bring her hardship. And she went into that willingly. I found that really fascinating about her character, that she chose that path, knowing the destruction it would probably bring her. So I guess that's how I'll introduce my thoughts about Gia. She's also somebody who's clearly, she's well-versed when it comes to herbs and the folklore when it comes to herbs. I love that. There was some kind of statement she makes about like the blade of grass being a great weapon or something. I know I'm forgetting the exact quote, but she obviously had a lot of skill, a lot of knowledge about that, and it seemed to complement what Cooney was after. So I feel like they had just such a lovely beginning to their relationship.
Yeah,
and it obviously went in some really difficult directions, I think, for her especially. Yeah, Philip, you want to follow up on Gia?
Sure. Yeah, I think she is. I like her, first of all, as a character, and like you, I love her herb lore and various aspects of her But she's also very ambitious. Gia is. She is ambitious for Kuni, and in a sense, for herself. Through him. I think she is always pushing him and propping him up, and is in many ways has a bigger vision than he does. I think, at least in the beginning, and I think that the reason she married him was, first, she saw him doing something compassionate also for the old woman who was being accosted, they were demanding the money from her or another son, to work on the press gang or whatever. And Kuni very cleverly got them off of her and said, hey, you go to here, I'll sign this little thing and you can bring it to my establishment and you can get some money. And of course, he's impersonating someone the whole time. And she understood all that and saw his compassion and his cleverness. And so I think that her ambition leads her to do some things that, I don't want to sound judgmental of her in any way whatsoever, because I think she makes very human decisions. And when she takes on her lover, for example, after being absent, being apart from Kuni for so long, that's she's missing the warmth of a human touch. She's missing, it would be easy to condemn her, I guess, for that. But the fact of the matter is, she's given a lot for this success of Kuni's and hasn't really taken a lot in return. And this is just something she wants to do for herself, while maintaining in her mind, at least, her loyalty to him. Like, she doesn't want to leave him for this other person. It's more like, this is something I need for myself while I'm propping you up here, and playing this role for you as a hostage, apart from you all this time. And then later, something similar, she tells him, you need a second wife. I'm not enough. You need another. This is, again, it's her ambition, I think, that leads her. And she's unconventional in these things in many ways. But I think it also, at the same time, that it's her ambition for him and his future. Her ambition for herself also turns Risana, that's the second wife, the one who can do things with smoke. It turns her into a rival, by the end. So my theory about what's coming is all of these allies who came together to support, first, they came together against Mappadere and his regime, and then his son. And then later it was Kuni versus Mata. And Kuni and all his allies came together, Luan and what's her name? The strategist woman.
Jin.
Jin.
Yeah.
I like her character a lot. They all came together, but by the end, as soon as they triumph, you can see the fractures. You can see the rivalries. You could see Gia very unhappy with Risana now, and Risana kind of clueless about that. And who actually observes it all is Soto, who is Mata's aunt, who actually sided ultimately with Kuni because she also saw this, the compassion in him. But these fractures are going to be a major part of what follows, I think, in the next book, is that these allies, just like Kuni, and this is going to be a theme, I think, here in the Dandelion Dynasty, allies turned enemies, friends turned foes. And I love that Ken Liu is a great enough storyteller to realize that he doesn't just go, Kuni and Mata don't go from friends to foes entirely. It's not black and white. There's still a friendship, even as they're trying to kill each other. They're still brothers. They still call each other brother, even amidst this rivalry. That was one thing I loved about this. And I felt that it's a premonition of what's to come, in a way, that these friends, allies who work together in this book are going to be at each other's throats in the next book. There's going to be some serious rivalries. It just feels like humans have to fight with somebody, and when you beat that big enemy and you've done it together, then you start kind of eyeing each other. Oh, okay. It happens over and over again. It's even the two guys who started the whole rebellion in the beginning, Huno Krima and Zopa Shigin. The one turns on the other as soon as they're successful, right? And it's just again and again and again, this theme keeps coming back of working together, but allies turning into foes. So I see that with, I think it's her ambition, Gia's ambition, that makes her eventually unhappy with how things have turned out. In a sense, she's not happy because she sees maybe Cooney, because of the way these are subtle things. I love the sort of the high context, the culture we have here, but just because of the names that Cooney gives his second wife's children, she's like, wait a minute, does he intend to make that kid the heir instead of my son? So it automatically turns into a rival instead of an ally there. Whereas it seems like Rosanna is innocent and doesn't seem to sense this impending rivalry. But
I agree with you, and that's so well said too about her ambition, about Gia's ambition.
Yeah. There
was this quote that they were saying over and over again in the beginning of the book about the most interesting thing is often not the easiest thing, and I was actually impressed with how when she's pregnant and Cooney and his people are there kind of like hiding away from the Empire and soldiers that are going after him. Sorry, I think there's a little bit of an echo in my microphone. But she's struggling with, obviously he's struggling with trying to hide from everything, and he sends his friend, I think it is Otho, I think it's the same guy, I want to say, that ends up having the affair with Gia, who goes after her and gets her to escape, and she's pregnant. And I'm like, oh my goodness, like she's already been estranged from her family because of his reputation, and now she's going out into the wild, like who knows where they're going to end up, and she's pregnant. And she ends up, she even seems to take all of this with good humor. Like she doesn't seem angry or upset with him about the situation. At least that was the impression I got. I could be remembering that wrong, but I was impressed with how much she was willing to go through with him, even to the point where there was one point where he says or realizes he feels like he's lost everything. And she tells him, you started with nothing, you could start over again with nothing.
Yeah.
So she was truly there for him. But again, like I think you nailed it with her ambition as well. Another thing I want to say about her too is how I felt like she was a good balance to Cooney, in that he was constantly taking risks. He was a trickster. He was somebody who could think on his feet quite a bit. And he did talk quite a bit about gambling. Like you have to gamble to win. You have to gamble to win. And I think there's something to be said about that, because I think we were talking about this right before we started recording. There are several other kings, like smaller, I don't want to say smaller, but other king characters in this book that maybe don't rise to the level that Cooney does. And maybe that says something about, the several qualities that he has going for him. But I think one of those qualities is his ability to know when to gamble. But at the same time, you can go too far with that. And her role, I think, or way she balanced with him was prudence. She brought up prudence to him a couple of times. And I think that was something that helped him in counsel. Like we said, he was willing to listen to the counsel of others, including women. And he had a respect for women. So I want to bring that up as well.
Good point.
Even though their affair maybe showed a side of him that I personally didn't care for, and obviously it was uncomfortable to read about that situation where he lost himself to debauchery. I think there was a side of him, I think, that also did deeply respect Gia and did listen to her. So I don't know. I thought that was a good balance to their relationship.
Yeah, he'd be nowhere without her. He would be nowhere without her. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I agree. Chris, you want to add anything?
Sure. Yeah, for Gia, definitely another strong character for me. I was happy we got so much of her later in the book. We had the few chapters here and there in the first half, and then that second half is where her characterization really took off for me. But that first chapter with her and the way she describes everything, like you mentioned with the grass and using herbs as a way to talk about her things. In fact, this is the things I like, where people pull like hints of what the title of our book is, The Grace of Kings, the Dandelion Dynasty, and we get those first indications of where the dandelion comes from. I do have a couple of the quotes here where she says, "The dandelion is a hardy and determined, adaptable and practical, but much more resourceful and far less delicate." Where she says, whereas the chrysanthemum, which was Malta's kind of flower, is the last to bloom in autumn, defiant against winter and overwhelms all competition, but is not a flower that endures. So I think it almost was like all put together for us, like in that first chapter, which I think was like chapter 4 or something like that.
Yeah.
This whole dynasty aspect to these two characters. And I feel like there's a little bit of Dandelion in her as well. I think she is the resourceful. She's far less delicate than she seems. I think, when we're reading those chapters where she feels trapped because she's sort of a in a hostage situation with Malta kind of keeping her, strategically with him, and she feels helpless, and that's when she reaches out to like Ortho for companionship, and then later on Soto for to get her that spirit back that she had when she first met Cooney. So and that was really good to see. And I will say, Philip, I think that's a good theory for what's coming up in the books. And I think it depends on where we jump in the books. Are we going to get to where the kids are going to be a little older, and then probably maybe their conflicts will probably take an effect, or maybe that'll be even in one of the later books. But and then of course pushed by their mothers, of trying to kind of nudge them into, their own destinies. I love the chapter of the letters that Gia and Cooney had back and forth with each other. And I think that's what really established the relationship for me, was that chapter, the back and forth with the hidden ink letters back and forth, where it was just a very vague message openly, because their letters were probably read, but then having that back and forth between the two really established that. I was a little disappointed with Cooney when he started going a little debauchery route, but I think that was just like a moment of weakness, and I don't think and I'm glad it didn't seem to stick, where it kind of went back into, like, hey, I can't do this, kind of life, so I forgave him for that. But yeah, Gia was a really strong character for me. I like to see what they do with her again in the next book.
Yeah. I'm trying to remember the person who woke him up out of that. Like, do you all remember which character that was? Was that?
It was one of his old friends. I think it was actually, it was the old advisor guy, Kogo Yellow, I think.
Kogo Yellow. Okay, yeah. Something that stuck with me towards the end of the book was how once Cooney wins and taking the young emperor over, that character Kogo realizes that Cooney no longer calls him by that term of endearment, like Kogzi. He no longer uses that name anymore, and he realizes they are no longer on the same level anymore. Whereas before, it seemed like part of Cooney's charm again was delegation and listening to people, the empathy part that Chris was bringing up earlier.
Yep.
And at this point, he's risen to a level where he can no longer be on that level with any of his advisors or friends anymore. Like there's a sense of separation. And I wonder about that as well with the whole idea of the grace of kings. It seemed like obviously there was some betrayal and backstabbing when it came to the grace of kings. But I also wonder if that part of that is also you can no longer look at people that way anymore. You have to have such a separation in order to do right by your people or your empire, so to speak.
Yeah.
Oh, it's so tragic. I don't know if I got the right idea with that, but if you all want to expand thoughts on the Grace of Kings title.
Yeah. I think it's brilliant how you have these characters who fall into these relationships. You know who I'm actually thinking is going to be really formidable in the next book is Jin Mazzotti. Watch out for her. At the end of this one, you see her understanding the possibility, hey, I could go out on my own and do pretty well here. And Luan actually, who had been pretty friendly with Cooney, kind of is pushing her in that direction as well. He's saying, you got to look out for yourself, sweetheart. And they're kind of a couple at this point. And the two of them together are actually really, dangerous, I think, because he's got the inventor smarts and he's kind of a genius, and he's also got that relationship with the god, with that book, which that was a kind of cool element. I like that. But then you've got her. She's the master strategist, in battle. So watch out, for that combination. But I mean, it's. I think I have the feeling it's going to get where these allies are going to be at each other's throats here. That's where I think the next book can possibly go. But but I love the idea that Chris brought up too, in terms of the titles, the Grace of Kings, but also the Dandelion Dynasty, and the idea earlier, because Cooney is literally a lower class person. He's like the Dandelion, and then you have Mata, who's, for me, far less interesting, with his hero kind of narrative that he's insisting on, and nearly makes it. I mean, he's got this powerful will that it works many times in battle. He is able to impose and make berserkers of his followers and win against the odds. And he almost does it at the very end too. And he's being chased down. They finally corner him at the beach there. And, it feels like he kind of, at the very, very end, breaks. He's more brittle, right? Whereas Cooney can bend, right? And that makes him much more versatile, more of a survivor. Whereas this is the point where we actually see Mata break, and he kills himself, actually. And then his followers do the same, basically, doing exactly what their leader did, which is to take their own lives rather than be beaten at the end. So just so he can say, no one ever beat me, at the very end, he takes his own life. Like, there's an inflexibility to this guy that I do not admire.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah. I also love what you're saying, because I feel like so much of the book, if you look at the two sides going on between Mata's side and Cooney's side, Mata's side is all about brute strength, like that force of will, brute strength. I like how you said that he created this army of berserkers in a way. That was his main strategy or main tactic. And on the other hand, you get the sense on Cooney's side with the character of Jean, fantastic strategist. And it proves that even as a woman, being such a strategist, she obviously becomes, like we talked about, she becomes a queen. She gains power in her own right because of that strategy, is what really changes the game with the tide of battle. And speaking of which, by the way, there were some really fascinating tides of battle in this story when it comes to the role of the airships, and then it comes to the role of those firecrackers to bring down the airships, and then
and the whales, and, all the whales stuff. Yeah.
Oh, yes, of course. So I a lot of movement going on as far as that was happening. Yes. So I don't know. I think that Jin speaks a lot to what we can understand about the role of strategy and how that can be so much more powerful in the end than just brute strength. I want to add anything, Chris?
No, I think for sure Philip touched on the aspect I wanted, especially with Jin and the thing. I think it was really important that Luan is very adamant throughout the book about Han and his loyalty to the Han, which is where now Jin is queenship of, and I think his homeworld he's very loyal to that homeworld of his, which is why he kept leaving, our hero to go back to home, to be where he wanted to be. And I think that's going to definitely, maybe we'll see something play out with that for sure.
And what you were saying, and yeah, just to piggyback off what you're saying about Han, as you said that Luan is very loyal and dedicated to his home to Han. That was something that we saw as a radical change for him with Mapidera, with that emperor, because we learned that Han was a place for scholars, that it had practical science, it had windmills, it had philosophy, it had the art of divination, which is part of the story. And yeah, so it obviously that changed dramatically as Mapidera burned books, got rid of things, and we understand that so much of Luan's strength in this book is from his inventor skills, as Philip said, or his like engineer knowledge. So it comes from a place of knowledge. And he also has that magical tome, right?
Yeah.
That magical book. So that was
from Lutho, the god. Yeah.
Okay, yeah, that's what, yeah. That was pretty cool.
Yeah. And it's not that the Zana Empire, Mapidere's side, is without their strategists too. I mean, Kindo Morana is also pretty clever.
Oh, yes. Yes.
Turns out to be, against, so Pyrrha wanted to sabotage the empire. And he had his little conspiracy along with Krupo there, who was the regent. And Krupo was also a very egotistic scholar who killed his rival. He poisoned his rival. I think it was poison, right? But anyway, neither one of them is an entirely trustworthy individual. But it turns out that Marana is a really good choice for a leader. Initially, he's a tax guy, right? He's not supposed to be good at this. He's supposed to be like a joke, right? But he turns out to be a really great choice.
Oh, wow. Yes.
His strategy. Yeah. And not that I love some of the things he did. I mean, what he does to Kikomi is terrible. What he makes her do in order to save her people from slaughter is to seduce both Mata and Mata's uncle, Finn, and introduce division, which is effective. It works. And she actually assassinates Finn, but does so in a way at the end that makes it incriminating for Marana and for the Zana Empire. So she does do his bidding, but shows her own cleverness in her final act of basically admitting her guilt, in the bedroom after she's killed him, and pretending to be actually in love with Marana. So I thought that was really tragic. There's one of the things that sticks out to me actually is her role here, is Kikomi's role and her tragic story and her sacrifice in the end, which wasn't worthy. It worked, in the sense that it was worthy in the sense that it worked. It did undermine Marana's plan. She was able to outfox him in the end, but tragically died in the process.
I felt like, if I understood this correctly, it seemed almost like Mata kind of respected Marana, even
he
after
had a hard
all
time.
of that.
Yeah, I mean, he made him into one of his followers. Once he captured him, he gave him a kingship later on in his sort of weird way of calculating who is worthy of, and he gave Marana the kingship of the main island of from Zana, which
that's right. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
To keep a close look on Kuni too.
Rui, yes. To keep an eye on Kuni over in that backwater Dasu, right, where he actually, from which he launched his takeover effectively, right? So,
wow, yes, that was extremely tragic. Kikomo's storyline, the role of Marana. Oh, yeah, that was it's somebody who does terrible things, but yeah, he does them very, very skillfully.
Yeah,
that certainly can't be denied.
Yeah, I mean, that's a theme you see again and again here too. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think we already mentioned them in part, but I guess if there's anything anyone wants to say about Huno Kima, and then his other follower, can't remember his name.
Shigen, the one he kills. Yeah. They concoct this silly thing with the fish, in the prophecy and the fish, right?
Yeah.
Later on, we learn it was actually completely set up, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Sure.
Yeah. And that's also where we get introduced to the two brothers, Jaffo and
Raffo
and
Ojap.
Yeah,
Zafiro and Rat.
Yes.
Yes.
Rat.
So I thought it was pretty clear what was going to happen. I mean, I kind of predicted that these
That
two
they would
brothers
be
were
on
going to.
opposite sides.
Yeah. And I did predict that Mata and Kuni would be on opposite sides, especially because they're called brothers early on. And there's kind of a parallel between these two kind of sets of brothers going on.
Yeah.
But I have to say, one little detail in the story that I remember really appreciating was when I think it was Zafira's the older one, and Zafira was remembering, like I think Rot was remembering their mother with great fondness or something, and Zafira was remembering her totally differently because she was obviously had alcohol, substance abuse addiction, and so he remembers her drinking every morning, saying, "I'm not going to do it. I'm going to be fine. I'm not going to drink today." And by the end of the day, she would just be completely wasted.
Yeah.
And how tragic, how difficult that was for her, and how they, because of their ages, they remember her differently.
Yep.
And it seemed to me that also informed the different ways that they looked at leadership and the way that, that Rot hero worshipped Mata versus how Zafiro worshipped, or didn't worship, but ended up on the different side. So I don't know. It was just like a little detail in the story, but for some reason it really moved me.
Yeah, that's really well said, Joanna.
It was definitely the show.
Go ahead,
It
Chris.
showed I was just going to say it showed the protection of the older brother, Daff with Rad, and I think, and so I think it made the separation of the two brothers going there, into each other's camps all the more impactful, because now Daff was no longer there to protect Rad. Rad made his own decisions, and it, they had to kind of grow into the roles that they were destined to have, and that conflict with each other eventually. And I'm glad that was the one thing, for how much I didn't really care for Mata. That was the one thing I liked at the end, was Mata saying, do not fight your brother. That is like, something you do not want to do. It'd be a regret on your part, for
which
that.
he's
and
done.
Yeah. Yeah. And so I appreciated that one aspect. And I was rooting for the two brothers. I wanted them to kind of be the analysts of what was going on in the story, almost like the tellers of both sides, and, kind of eventually come together. And I'm really sad that, Rat didn't make it. But but I loved that little side story for sure. And I like that you touched on that very detail, which I think is important, about, how, you have this perception of somebody that clearly wasn't true, and only because you were protected by somebody looking out for you.
Yeah.
It's very true to life too. I think that an older sibling would have a more realistic view or a different view of a parent than a younger sibling who, often it's the older sibling who takes the brunt of a parent's mistakes, I think, and oftentimes even protects the younger siblings from that. And I love your observation, Joanna, about the idea that they take their ideas of leadership from that early experience, that it's easier for Ratho to hero worship because he was never disillusioned the way Dafiro was about their mother. So that's really cool. Good call.
Yeah. It was sad. It was a sad part. And it's interesting too, also, what you were saying to Chris about that showed a side of Mata that you appreciated, because I know we're talking about Mata more in the negative, but he did have some qualities that I think were understandable. Because
classic hero,
Yeah, exactly. He had his ideas of heroicism were just rooted in an old traditional way of seeing things. And that was why he at first had difficulty with Cooney's way of saying things. Like, why would you do that? We're gonna look, we're gonna look weak. Whereas
for
Cooney
Mata, my descriptors were honor and tradition. And I think, to a fault, unfortunately, that was for him, that he lived in that traditional sense, because I think that was part of his downfall, including his honor, and that
Yeah.
was a little.
And I feel like it was almost like a very patriarchal kind of perception too.
Oh, yeah.
Like we don't want to look womanly, we don't want to look girlish. Whereas Cooney, he had a totally different understanding of women and their role in society, and gives that whole speech about like, what about your mothers? What about your wives? Think about where you'd be if it weren't for them doing this or doing that. So I feel like, but at the same time, it's understandable, like how he was raised with these ideas, and that was also part of the fault, like you said, and it also was what brought them at odds with each other as far as their vision for the new empire then after the rebellion, because obviously Cooney wanted to create something totally new. He says something about that, how he wanted to create something new, whereas Mata wanted to create something that was from the past.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
It's hard to blame, Mata for being the way he is, because he's clearly very gifted. The gods, particularly the one of the two twin sisters, I always get them confused. Kana and
he had Rana. Rana was his.
Kana and Rapa.
Kana
is the one who wants to back Mata. Yeah.
She was the volcano goddess.
Yes. Yeah. Which is fitting. He seems pretty volcanic in his temperament. But yeah, he's got these gifts, and he clearly feels destined for something great. He's been singled out. He's larger than everybody else. He has weird eyes.
Yeah.
I was still trying to picture that double pupil thing. Really.
So he has this sense of destiny that he walks around with, and it gets him pretty far. You have to say it gets him pretty far, but that lack of flexibility in the end does him in, whereas it's the clever ones clearly who win. And this is it's a very different series from A Song of Ice and Fire, but one of the things that you see in A Song of Ice and Fire is it's the clever ones, the devious ones that often get ahead, not the ones with this great sense of honor, and doing what is, heroic and that kind of thing. There's a kind of naivete to that can undo you if you're not careful. And even as formidable as he is, his inflexibility, I think in the end, he isn't entirely inflexible in that he does strike up this brotherhood, this friendship with Cooney, and genuinely feels a sense of affection for him, even at the worst, when they're at each other's throats. So there are aspects to him that I find admirable, and he's like I said, a classic hero who is a embodiment of courage and propriety and all of that. But it's he's not flexible in the way that Cooney is, and that means he's on the losing side ultimately.
Which is so hard, because in the beginning, when he is allied with Cooney, when they are getting along, when they become quote unquote brothers, that he does end up becoming a little bit more flexible. He surprises himself, and he sees how it turns out in his favor. Like he doubts it. He's doubtful. He's like, okay, I don't believe you're doing this right, but I'll go along with it. Yeah. And it turns out working in their favor. So he starts to see the genius that Cooney has. Yeah. But unfortunately, it's not enough. When they're distanced from each other and things go awry, that trust turns very fragile. I think this book really spoke to me about the fragility of trust, especially with distance involved.
Yeah.
Yeah. That's something that just, and the other thing too, is speaking of to his honor, to those aspects of him, those traditional parts of him, we have to talk about the other character. I cannot remember her name. I'm so sorry. Is it Mira? Lady Mira?
Oh, yes, Mata's sort of love interest, I guess, who does the embroidering, increasingly abstract images to capture the essence of Mata. Yeah. Fascinating character. And her brother died in his service to him as well. So there is that aspect of, does he really appreciate my brother or not? And there's a complex, conflicting emotions going on in her in relation to Mata as well, right?
Yes.
And the role she's sort of, everyone perceives her as his concubine or lover or whatever, and that's not the role she is actually. She's serving as a reminder of home for him, and I think she kind of uses that a little bit, right? She knows how to cook certain recipes that she knows are going to calm him down, and that kind of thing, and is able to get inside his head that way. But she clearly performs a certain function for him, a reminder of something that is, he's so rigid and has for himself really, burned a lot of bridges. He's lost a lot of friends, and he wants to isolate himself in this power, right? And she's a reminder of something more tender in him, something from his boyhood, even.
Right. I think that's what it was. Like, she reminded him of his home.
Yeah.
And so certain things she said some things that challenged him too at times. And he was willing to listen. He was willing to confront those things. So in some ways, I think that showed some part of his character that was good. Yeah, he certainly was a bit of a gray character, I would say, in a lot of ways. But it also was hurtful to her. I think the harder part for her, the part that I guess I can't remember what it was. I guess it was that he doesn't remember her brother, and that was the most difficult part for her.
Didn't remember his name. Yeah.
Didn't remember his name. Yeah.
What do you make of the images that she embroiders of him, and how they get increasingly abstract and finally seem to convey the essence of him in a very simplified form? Does that say that he is actually ultimately a pretty simple man? That is he kind of? I mean, she does. It's like she's Picasso with embroidery, but she's capturing him somehow in a way that's, she captures his power, his heroism, his courage, but also his lack of flexibility, his destructiveness. There are two sides to this guy, or multiple sides.
That's interesting. I know he was super critical of her embroidery. Like, he was like, "Oh, it's just womanly tasks, and what good is that? That's not winning wars. That's not doing men's work."
Right.
But I think he also felt threatened by it too. That's the sense I got. I wrote down this quote here. It says, "Since that day when she had told him what she thought of his glorious deeds, he had been unable to see himself except through her eyes, cruel, unnecessary, inelegant, and trivial." Because she turns it back on him. She's like, "Oh yeah, well, what about you and what you're doing? And is that so, not trivial?" So I think that he starts to question himself and doubt some of his beliefs because of her.
I think this was related to this area, but one of the quotes I had was, "By custom we wield the sword and wear the armor, but who amongst us does not know a mother, sister, daughter, friend who exceeds you in courage and fortitude? So let us no more think of being compared to women as an insult." And
yes.
That's Cooney, I think.
That's Cooney, yeah.
Okay. I wasn't sure if I was trying to remember, and I had it down for this area, but
it's a good contrast to Mata, who is, like Joanna said, he's very patriarchal, very conservative, very traditional in his values and outlook.
I would say if my constructive, I would have loved more scenes between Mira and Malta. I think that would have really helped kind of maybe give more complexity to Malta. But yeah, I definitely wanted more Mira.
Yeah. So any thoughts about Mata's death? I mean, we kind of talked about that already a little bit, but were you all surprised that he died at the end, or?
I felt like it was coming because it's the Dandelion Dynasty, not the Chrysanthemum Dynasty.
Yeah, I mean, I kind of felt the same. I mean, after things just started, I knew this was going to be pretty tragic. I think, as I mentioned with the Gia chapter, where we get that it's a flower that does not endure, kind of thing. And when we got that at the end, I'm like, oh, okay, well, that's kind of spoils the whole book for me. But no, I think they handled that really well, and I think both of you said, we did get that final realization in Mata's mind, of why he failed in the end. And I think I mean, I knew it was coming. I'm glad it was him for sure over our guy. But it didn't come as a surprise for me, and but I thought it was still well done and well executed, of a fitting ending for sure.
Yeah.
Yeah, the fact that he had this large following, and then I like the aspect that they were talking about numbers towards the end there, and how his numbers kept dwindling, and then he was down to like a dozen, followers at the end there, and they just continued to hold their ground. And one of them, of course, being Brat, and I thought, oh yeah, that's all I cared for. That was really, I was like, hang on there, Rat, but unfortunately, he went with them. So
yeah, poor Brat. That's sad.
Yeah, I mean, you could look at it as courage in the face of certain doom there, but it's also, again, I think it's inflexibility, and that put him where he was. He kept thinking, I can just bull my way through this, and I'm going to win. That's what I do, and he put himself. Yeah, I mean, he and not just in warfare, but in his relationships with people, his. And ultimately, in with his rivalry / friendship, brotherhood with Cooney, it's his old-fashioned thinking that I'm the noble here, I should be the one who's in charge. This shifty nobody guy, how could he possibly, beat me? Because I'm the hero. This is the narrative. He keeps insisting, I'm the hero. I'm supposed to win here, right? And then that lack of imagination on his part, that lack of being able to think outside of his box, puts him where he ends up. Both in terms of, I feel like Cooney would have made it up with him if he could have.
Absolutely.
But Mata is so inflexible that he can only have it one way. As you said, Joanna, there were signs in him earlier that he was learning from Cooney, but that got broken up when the mistrust came into play.
So early in the book that I was like, oh, this is
well, I think what did it ultimately was Cooney successfully taking that city of the emperor, and I'm trying to remember the name of it, Pan, right?
Oh,
and taking the emperor's son, Erishi, who had become the emperor, capturing him, and thereby winning this kingship of that region that was promised to whoever achieved that, right? And that was supposed to be Mata's achievement, right? How dare he do that? And not only take away his achievement, but he did it in a sneaky way, not in an honorable way. And that's not the narrative, right? And his inflexibility led to this rift. He could not envision the narrative any other way, and it couldn't envision anyone else in the hero role except himself, right? So, and then he does some terrible things, horrible things. Honestly, he kills innocent people and burns down the city just out of spite. That should have been me. I should have done this, And he tries to rewrite the narrative, and that's where he really goes awry, I think.
Yeah. I agree with that. And yet Cooney taking over, gosh, I'm sorry, you just said his name. Erishi, is that right?
Erishi, yeah, the young emperor, yeah.
Doing it in a trickster way that is consistent with Cooney at the same time. But you're right. It was quite a decline for Mata, especially at the end. So
it bothered me so much how stubborn he was, and not, as much as Cooney was like, here you go, here you go. I'm giving this to you, or, just saying, make it your own,
But he doesn't want to give it to him. He wants to win it, right?
He wants to win it, yeah. And it just, it's like, oh man, this just knew it wasn't going to end well for that.
I also think it speaks to, again, the fragility of trust, not only, like I mentioned, through distance, how that is a conflict of not just for Mata and Kuni, but also for Kuni and Gia, but also like the rise in power, how little you can trust people after you gain so much power. I think early on it was easier for Mata to be a little more flexible, because he didn't quite have as much power as he does towards the end. But at the end, I don't know. It seems like both of them are, well, obviously it comes to an end for Mata, but who can you trust when you have that much power? I think that it gets more and more difficult. Even if you Go
I
ahead.
like the way you're discussing distance and the fact that I think when, we interact with people, we kind of forget the closeness we make when we bond with somebody on a one-to-one basis. But then if you don't talk to that person for a while, sometimes you lose touch, you lose that closeness with somebody you've built a relationship with, your friends, especially, think of like COVID during the times when we didn't really have connections with people minus Zoom. We lost that interpersonal connection, and then you start losing some of the reasons where that friendship was built on, or friends that you've had like when you were younger or something along those lines. And the touch of that distance, the loss of having that connection, definitely I think played its toll on both of the characters.
Yeah.
If they were around each other more often, I think that brotherhood would have stuck, because they conflict well with each other when they're together.
Yes.
Similar with Kuni and Gia too. They're separated.
Yeah.
And when they finally get back together, it's like they have to get to know each other again. It's a little awkward for a while for them, because they want this, but it just everything's a little off, because you're not quite the same person that I knew before, and we have to make some adjustments here, right? They do it successfully, though, sort of, because I feel like her jealousy of wife number 2 there at the end is going to lead to some bad things. So,
and we'll see. I'm really curious about that. How that's going to affect things in later storylines.
I'll be most curious of if they jump time, like maybe slightly older kids, or
yeah.
Or right after the events of this book.
Yeah, and that's so well said, Chris, about distance and connection. I feel like we have it a little easier now with technology as a convenience when it comes to that distance, but I still think that there are so many challenges when it comes to long distance relationships of any kind. I think that, and especially in this period of this book, in this world where Gia is going a long time and she's going through struggles, she's going through raising her children, and she's feeling angry at times, but she can't express that. She can't really express that to Kuni in the same way.
I thought I'd written it down, but when the beginning of the chapters, I was trying to keep track of the dates to see how much time was actually passing between like certain events. Of course, I didn't save that or write it down. But yeah, I mean, I think it was clear on how much time was passing. How much distance they did not have, especially with Gia and Kuni.
Yeah. And maybe for Kuni, he was also going through a lot, obviously, with everything he was taking on, but maybe repressing it a lot. And then, I don't know. I just think they suffered a lot because of that. And I'm so curious about the solution that they've chosen and what's going to happen again in the next installment.
Yeah, because I don't think anything after this is based on any historical event.
No, I don't think so either. Yeah.
It's all canon. Yeah.
I mean, that's my understanding, is that we really depart after book 1 and do something different. So I don't know. I've heard great things about Wall of Storms, which is book 2. A lot of people consider it their favorite in the series.
Wow.
So yeah, I guess we'll find out. Although people love the whole series, so I guess
they progressively get thicker too.
I know they do get thicker. Yes. Great. Any other thoughts? Anyone? Any other parts of the book that we wanted to talk about?
I don't think so. I think, yeah, I'm looking forward to seeing what happens. I do see some thematic similarities. Stylistically, it's very different so far, anyway. But I see some thematic similarities to A Song of Ice and Fire with the machinations and the idea that just the old-fashioned courage and honor and all of that is going to end up getting you in trouble. And it's the crafty ones that actually usually come out on top. So
You have to know how to play the game,
you have to know how to play the game.
or you're just a player in the game, right?
Yep.
It's like play or be played.
Yep. So I am looking forward to the next book because I also hear great things. So I'm hoping to love it.
I hope so too.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Well, I want to thank you both for joining me for this discussion. I really enjoyed what both of you had to share about this book. I'm excited to continue this journey with both of you as well. So I think the next discussion is going to be either on Chris's channel or Philip's channel. We'll decide that when we get there, I guess. But for now, if you're watching, thank you so much. Please share your comments in the comment section below. We'd love to hear from you. And have a great rest of your day. Bye-bye.